Hey, listener, this is Grant from the future here. We recorded this episode before Charlie Kirk's shooter was caught and before we knew any information about who he was, so Liz and I decided to steer away from that conversation today because there were just too many unknowns. I can tell you as I'm recording right now, what we know is that the governor of Utah and the FBI and the president have confirmed that the shooter is a 22-year-old shooter from Utah. Right now, there are certain messages that have been written on bullet casings that seem to be anti-fascist motivated, but the shooter also does not have a clear ideology or clear party affiliation, and so we don't know a lot about this person right now. What we do know is that the shooter does not seem to be trans. The shooter does not, like I said, have any registered party affiliation and is not an immigrant, as some people, specifically on the right, if you listen to my Thursday episode, have suggested about who this person is. The thing that I will say is that we will know more in the coming days, and this story is rapidly developing. There's going to be a lot of things you're going to see and hear on social media. A lot of those things will be incorrect because it'll be incomplete information, or people will just be making them up for their own political aims. Apart from those things is that we are also going to learn more about this shooter because we have the rare occasion here in which this person is alive. Normally, these people are dead after these things, whether they die in a gunfight or they take their own lives, and we don't get to know the motive behind these horrific acts. And this time, this person will, apart from anything else happening, go through with a full prosecution and a full case, and we will know more. But right now, we don't know much. I just wanted to get that out of the way before we get into this episode so you didn't think that I'm ignoring that story because it's breaking actively as I'm recording right now. All right, let's get to the show. It's Friday, September 12th, 2025. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Granthermes. Today in the show, I have been waiting to cover this topic for a little while. Not because I didn't feel equipped to do it, but because things have been moving so quickly. What we're talking about today, again, is the crisis in the court system in America, in our judiciary. And I've been waiting to be able to get Liz Dye back on the show, the host of the Law and Chaos podcast and Substack. And also you can see her on Legal Eagle on the YouTube channel there, which is massively popular. She is one of the best thinkers and writers and speakers about what's happening in our judicial system right now. And so I've been waiting to get her back on because what we're talking about here is something called the shadow docket. It's really called the emergency docket, but it's what happens in between the Supreme Court's spring and fall terms, which we're coming up in the fall term very shortly. But in the middle, over that summer, is this thing called the shadow docket, which law doesn't take a summer off. Things that happen in politics don't take a summer off. So the Supreme Court and the courts themselves have to keep taking cases. And sometimes those cases require emergencies. Often, and you'll hear Liz and I talk about this, those things are stays of executions of inmates in prisons in certain states. Those are the classic midnight execution stay orders from the Supreme Court. But lately, the Trump administration has been using a lot of these emergency powers to run roughshod over the normal political and legal process. And it's called the shadow docket because they're not official cases. They're just things the Supreme Court takes up. They just write an opinion, spit it out, and leave it for the lower courts to decide. It's not exactly, as Liz will explain, the best way to make sound law. And like I said, there have been a lot more of those cases this time around. Case in point, last year for the shadow docket, there were just 44 shadow docket emergency cases. This year, 113, which gives you a sense of just how much pressure the Trump administration has been putting on the court system, putting on the Supreme Court. And Liz and I talk a lot about what that means for the health of our legal system and then for America as a whole. We're going to drill down on a couple specific cases, specifically around immigration. One from back in March that I have talked about before, and then another that happened very recently over Labor Day weekend, where 90 Guatemalan children were nearly deported from the U.S. back to places that they do not want to go back to because the Trump administration said it was an emergency to remove them. And then we also talk a little bit about the pressure being felt on the court system right now in the states where we all live because they don't know what to do with what's happening with this shadow docket. So before we get to that, make sure you're subscribed or following the show, whatever podcast app you listen to this on. Like, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. If you're a watcher on YouTube, sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I've got brand new articles going up each week, and share the show on social media. It's Mims Newspod. That's MIMS Newspod, all one word, on every platform. I am at Granthermes on X and Bluesky, and at Granthermes TV on everything else. And let's get to my conversation today with Liz Dye, because we hit the ground running. I try hard on Make It Make Sense to give you a complete picture of the biggest stories, but I'm only one guy, and staying up to date with events around the world can be difficult for anyone when it's impossible to consult a single source for the full story. And with our social media algorithms sending us the versions of the news that only reinforce our own biases, it can be hard to know if you're actually informed, even for me. And that's why I've been using Ground News. Ground News is an app and a website that combines news from around the world all in one place, so you can compare coverage from every news source, and you can see if they have a political bias, how reliable their reporting is, and who owns them. My favorite feature is the blind spot feed. It highlights news disproportionately covered by one side or the other, so I can make sure I know how the news is being covered. It's like Make It Make Sense for Make It Make Sense. Right now, if you subscribe through my link in the show notes, you get 40% off the Vantage subscription. It's the one I use to get unlimited access to every feature, and it is just $60 for the entire year or $5 a month when you use that link. Your subscription helps Make It Make Sense, too. We get a cut of this subscription, but you're also helping Ground News make the news more transparent. Again, use the code in the show notes to get 40% off your Vantage subscription to Ground News. All right, let's get back to the show. Well, Liz, thank you again for coming on the show. You're the person that I turn to for like all legal things now at this point. It's just long chaos.
Yeah, well, there's quite a bit of chaos in the judiciary, right? I think the judiciary is really being squeezed from two directions at once. The first is they're getting this pressure upward from the Trump administration, right? The Justice Department is bombarding them with crazy stuff, and they're getting it top down from the Supreme Court, which is basically rewriting all of precedent or yanking away precedent every single day in ways that lower court judges just aren't able to function. And you can see that particularly with the shadow docket, right? And people ask, what is the shadow docket?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Let's when we talk about this like squeezing, let's start at the top and start with the shadow docket here, because like that's a pretty heavy weight on the top of this squeeze.
It absolutely is. And so the shadow docket is like all the stuff that happens not in regular order. What happens in regular order? The Supreme Court gets a petition for certiorari. That's appeal at the Supreme Court, and they consider it. They decide if they're going to take it. They mostly don't take it, right? And if they do take it, there's like several months of briefing, and then there's oral argument, and there's several months of considering the case, and then eventually they put out a decision after the benefit of briefing. But remember, most of those decisions come after a case has been at the trial court. That's the U.S. district courts in all of the cities. They go up to the circuit courts, of which there are 13 federal circuit courts, and then only maybe do they come to the Supreme Court. And what's the shadow docket is stuff that happens not there. So sometimes there'll be an emergency petition, most of those used to be requests to stay in execution, because that's an emergency, because if they don't do something, somebody's going to die.
The proverbial midnight stay from the Supreme Court of an execution in some state. That was like, I'm thinking of a very specific West Wing episode right now in which that happens. But that was how this was. They were emergencies, because the real name for the shadow docket is the emergency docket.
Right. Well, actually, it's funny because Justice Kavanaugh, they've taken so much criticism now, he'd like to call it the interim docket. I bet you would. I bet you would, sir.
Yeah, sure, man.
No, right. They don't like the shadow docket. Justice Sam Alito is really, really touchy about it being called the shadow docket, because I think he implies that it's shady or whatever. And he gets very mad about it in public on a regular basis, because a hit dog will holler. And, he's like, it's not a nefarious cabal. We're just doing our jobs. But that's really a lie. I mean, the reason that people really started getting worked up about the shadow docket was the Dobbs opinion, or the precursor to the Dobbs opinion, which ended abortion. It overturned Roe v. Wade. And what happened was Texas had a law that functionally banned abortion, and it came up on the shadow docket. And on the shadow docket, the Supreme Court said, Texas, you may put this law into effect, which functionally overturned Roe v. Wade. That was a case called Jackson v. Whole Women's Health. And since then, there's been a great reliance, and particularly during the Trump administration, on the shadow docket to make new law, right? You were never supposed to make new law on the shadow docket. And indeed, shadow docket orders were not supposed to be precedential because they did not come after the full briefing as would be a normal order. But now the Supreme Court is saying they are precedential and they want the lower courts to follow them. But as precedent, they're not all that great because often it's just, as we said, the big Sharpie X through the lower court's work that they painstakingly, these lower court judges have, found fact and taken briefing and maybe heard oral argument and deposition. And the Supreme Court saying, no, not that, doesn't provide a rubric for what lower courts are supposed to do. And we've seen in so many of the cases during the Trump administration, the way that they've used the shadow docket is it's in three primary areas. One is the impoundment cases. That is the Trump administration wants to not follow the budget. And remember, the budget's a law, and the Constitution gives Congress the power over the budget. And the Trump administration is like, no, we're just not going to do that, right? And lower courts have had these long finding facts, and they'll issue 100 or a 75-page opinion that says, Trump administration, you have to follow the law. The Constitution, the Appropriations Clause gives the power over the budget to Congress. And the Supreme Court just says, nah. And then when lower courts are like, I don't know what to do with nah, so all I can do is follow the Constitution, and they write other opinions that say, Trump administration, you have to spend the money. And then the Supreme Court gets pissed and says, didn't you hear our nah? Didn't you understand that meant that you had to whatever, let the Trump administration steal the budget power? We've seen it in these the hiring and firing cases, right? That the law says, and in fact, there's precedent written by Chief Justice John Roberts from 2020 that says the Trump administration can't fire every member of every board. And and lower courts who said, this is what the law says. This is the precedent that exists. And again, the Supreme Court's like, nah. And then when lower courts are like, okay, but we still have to follow the law, then Justice Gorsuch particularly keeps writing these kind of little nasty grams, and Kavanaugh too, that say you should have followed our precedent. Well, there is no precedent because A, the shadow docket's not supposed to be precedent. And B, you didn't give lower courts anything to go on. And so you're seeing this kind of pushback from the lower courts that you never, ever would have seen in previous administrations, right? There was at NBC, there's a reporter, Lawrence Hurley, interviewed 12 judges, 10 of whom had really negative things to say about the Roberts Court's shadow docket jurisprudence, because they said, look, the Trump administration is attacking us every day. You're not coming out to defend us. And indeed, you're excoriating us for not reading the tea leaves, the goat entrails of your mind, big Sharpie X out of our opinions. And you are leaving all of this space for the Trump administration to attack us and say that we're stupid or defiant or whatever. And how are we supposed to work in these conditions? And you are seeing it in judicial opinions even, which is wild. The First Circuit this week, in one of these, the third things that the Trump administration has had a lot of pushback is that they've tried to shut down federal agencies, right? There were all of those, like the U.S. Institute of Peace, and they're even talking about trying to shut down the Department of Education. And they can't do that. That's not legal, right? Congress, set these agencies up and funded them, and those are laws. The Trump administration, the president can't just say oh, well, the Department of Education doesn't exist anymore. But that's what he's done via executive order. And the Supreme Court has said, go for it, again, with the big Sharpie over the lower court opinion. And lower courts don't know what to do. So this week, two crazy things happened on like the same day. One was that the First Circuit in one of these agency shutdown orders had a very specific, like, well, all that you have said in this case where you just X'd us out was we're staying the lower court opinion and we have no rubric. And so if the Supreme Court wants us to follow our precedent, you're going to have to spell it out. It's a crazy thing for judges to say in a circuit court opinion. And the very same day, there was oral argument in the Fourth Circuit on a similar case. And actually, it was not quite similar. It was one of those cases where DOJ wanted to get into the Social Security. It's not the same case. It was one of the similar cases where DOJ wanted to get all of the Social Security records. In this case, the Supreme Court already jumped in a very brief, like 5, paragraph opinion, a shadow docket order, and said, basically, let DOJ take all your stuff. And they did. We've seen a whistleblower report that what happened is that the DOJ guys put everyone's Social Security data on unprotected hard drives. In total,
it was like Microsoft Cloud. Like it was like a OneDrive. You use it work for emails.
Crazy, right? So that's like, thanks to you, Justice Roberts, right? And so they've done that. And so then they sent the case back to the lower courts to do their work. And the lower courts, there was this argument among the justices of the Fourth Circuit. These are a lot of very eminent justices and long-serving. One, Harvey Wilkinson, is a Reagan appointee, a stalwart conservative. And he said, like, well, we got to follow it, even though we don't know what it is. But most of the other judges said, what are we supposed to do with this? There is no precedent to follow. I don't know how we're supposed to do this work. The Supreme Court is throwing us under the bus. If you don't, make yourself known, what the hell are we supposed to do?
Right. It does strike me as two things, and I think these are actually kind of related. But the first one is that, like, so far the Roberts Court has not been overly concerned with precedent or stare decisis or any of those ideas that like past law should inform the law they're making now, which is a fundamental way that we create laws in the United States to be just.
That's common law.
They just don't seem concerned with that process or those principles at all, which seem, I mean, if I was a district court judge, if I was a circuit court judge, I wouldn't know what to do with that kind of a Supreme Court at all.
Right. It's like trying to cross a bridge while it's blowing up under you, right? They're in this like video game. And I think, to mix a metaphor, it's like the Looney Tunes cartoons where, the machine is overheating. And that's what's happening in the federal judiciary. Like pieces are popping off. Judges in the past would never give blind quotes to a reporter. 12 of them doing that is crazy. It's unheard of. It is a sign that the judiciary is in crisis. And I agree with you that the Supreme Court has the power now. The 6 conservative justices know that they have the power. And what they are doing is functionally telling the lower courts, you are just the warm-up act. We are the entire power. We will make the law. And in fact, we will remake the law as we have wanted to do. And their partner in this is the Trump administration, which, as I said, it's coming from the bottom up too. The Trump administration came in, and this time around, it wasn't like this the first time. The first time there were normies in the administration, and they wanted to kind of appear to be normal, to appear to be doing real law. And so they did try and kind of make it look law-like. They did some crazy stuff. This time, they did not bother. This time they came in and they said, we are going to do everything all at once because eventually things will catch up. We'll lose one house of Congress or the judiciary might try and stop us. They just did everything all at once, right? They did all of the budget things. They fired the entire federal bureaucracy. They shut down agencies. They sent DOJ in there to do crazy stuff. They cut all the foreign aid. They're bombing boats. I mean, I'm sure you've talked about this on your show where the bombing the Venezuelan boat absolutely violated the law of war. And they're doing all this crazy immigration stuff, right? That they're just kidnapping children in the middle of the night and stuffing them on planes and trying to get them out of the country before the courts can catch up with them. And so there's this constant pressure on the courts because the Trump administration is breaking the law every bloody day.
Right. It is also interesting to me, too, that the Supreme Court is taking what kind of appears to be like a maximalist executive approach to their
Absolutely.
job. It is very in line with the like unitary power of the presidency, but
Hmm.
just as the Supreme Court. And like listeners, I've talked about this before, but that's the idea that the president can do anything the president wants to do because they are the president, because they are an extension of the people in doing so. It's a really
Hmm.
oversimplified version of that thing, but that's
Of course.
basically the president can do no wrong. And the Supreme Court is also sort of taking that position, which also then in some way lets them escape accountability for this. I think the like shadow docket of it all is that the Supreme Court is taking this big red X, all these things, and giving them back to the lower courts, and then being like, great, read our goat entrails, like you
Right.
said. Like, but they don't have to explain that. They just are telling the courts, you don't have, like, you have to figure this out. We're not going to explain it because then we don't own it, which I also think is a weird way for this court to behave.
Yeah, it's very funny because, like I said, Justice Kavanaugh gets real testy about this criticism of the shadow docket. And last week he did something that I think I've written about it as like Leroy Jenkins out there and was like, yes, we definitely are doing the racism.
Yeah.
And it had to do with a decision out of California where the trial court said you can't use like race as a factor for all of these ICE raids, or you can't just, go into a place where a lot of undocumented people you think work and grab everybody who's brown. That's totally violates, the First and Fourth Amendments.
It's racial profiling. It is
Of
illegal
course
racial
it is.
profiling.
It is absolutely illegal racial profiling. And the Supreme Court, the rest of the conservative justices voted, to put on the shadow docket to stay that lower court's order. They said nothing. They did it in one paragraph because it's indefensible, right? And if you're going to take the hit for being racist, you probably only want to do it once. They made the decision that taking the reputational hit for doing this shady shadow docket stuff and not explaining themselves was better than taking the hit twice for doing something totally crazy and racist and illegal.
Mm-hmm.
But Justice Kavanaugh is so sensitive and thin-skinned about this shadow docket stuff that he went right out there and he was like, no, we are 100% doing racism because there's like 1 in 10 people in Los Angeles is, undocumented, and undocumented people are so bad for society. Well, he didn't say undocumented people. And, I feel sorry for them, but they're all criminals. And so it makes sense. And like, no, man, that's just so racist. And it did not reflect well on the court. And I think that the Supreme Court will either take the hit on it or find some procedural way to kick it. The Supreme Court's conservatives, they'll say, like, well, the plaintiffs didn't have standing to challenge this or some other thing. But he just like went out there and went for it. It was like, no, we're super, super racist. Don't get it twisted. This is what we're doing. I don't think that the other justices were super impressed with his running his mouth, but like it's clear what this project is.
Yes. And also I don't know, irony, coincidence, I'd pick your Alanis Morissette, whatever. But like the just a few days after that decision came out, there was the raid on the Georgia battery plant where they rounded up a bunch of South Korean workers who were in the United States. Most of them, I'm fairly certain, legally. They were here on like a work visa program from
Right.
South Korea to teach people how to build batteries. That will cost Georgia thousands of jobs now. But it's likely that the Supreme Court is going to have to rule on something like this again because of that. Because now there are people in Georgia talking about bringing this to the emergency docket, to the shadow.
Right. Right. And who knows what they're going to. I mean, I do know what they're going to do, which is to let the Trump administration get away with it. But I think there's, from the other side, we're seeing a response from the lower court judges who are, rightly pissed at the Supreme Court. And they are, there is a thing called presumption of regularity, which is what the government is supposed to enjoy, that the court is supposed to assume that the government is telling the truth. When the Justice Department makes a representation to the court, the Justice Department enjoys the assumption, the presumption that they are saying things that are true and that they're on the up and up. And they've wasted that. They've pissed it away in a mere 9 months, 8 months even, because they've told so many lies to the to courts and to other litigants that they've. So I think really it's so illustrative to talk about two cases. One was in March and one was in August. And they are the JGG case with the Alien Enemies Act deportees, those men that we sent to CICOT, mostly Venezuelan nationals that we shipped to CICOT in El Salvador, which is a gulag type prison where they were detained for a long time. And for months, the U.S. government said, we don't have any control over them. We can't get them back. And that was in the famous Kilmar Abrego Garcia case. And then it turned out to be an absolute lie, right? Because they could get Abrego Garcia, back the second they wanted. They didn't even have to file extradition papers to get him. They just snapped their fingers and there he was when they wanted to indict him. And two, I mean, more, I think egregiously, the entire time that we were saying we don't control these Venezuelan nationals in this Salvadoran prison, the second we wanted to trade them for U.S. nationals held in Venezuelan prisons, that prisoner swap went through. We negotiated the prisoner swap, which means that we really did have custody of them the whole time.
Yes. I mean, even on paper, I talked about this on the show. I wrote about it on the Substack, that the United States had a contract with El Salvador in writing, that El Salvador was just hosting these people. It's a terrible word for it, but like that's just what they were, just holding them there for the U.S.
Right.
So our laws and our control of those people and over their lives extended to them in this torture prison, because we have people who've been back in the United States. The hairdresser, whose name escapes me at the moment,
Andre, yeah, and yes. I think he went back to Venezuela.
Yes,
right. But he talked about the conditions and the reason that the U.S. government needed, in quotes, for these Venezuelan nationals to not be in our custody is that if they were in our custody, we would be responsible for the conditions of their confinement and the torture that they suffered. And we didn't want to do that. And that's why the U.S. government refused to disclose to multiple courts the contract that you're referring to with the Salvadoran government, because we didn't want courts to, make us responsible for the conditions of these men's confinement or to force us to bring them back. But so the way that this went down was on the week of March 15th, the Trump administration signed this Alien Enemies Act proclamation saying that, we were under invasion. The U.S. is under invasion by the government of Venezuela by dint of these Venezuelan gang member Tren de Aragua shock troops, which is preposterous on its face. Obviously, that's nonsense. But they hid the proclamation. They rounded up all of these Venezuelan nationals, put them on planes, published the proclamation in such a way, what were the guys going to do? They were already on the planes. They couldn't challenge their deportation. And then when the ACLU moved to challenge this deportation, the Justice Department's lawyer, Drew Ensign, showed up in court in DC, and Judge Boasberg said, are there planes in the air, more planes scheduled to take off? And Ensign said no, which according to the whistleblower report was a total lie. He knew that. And Judge Boasberg said, make sure those planes do not take off and do not turn around. We're going to take a brief break. You go, convey that to your client, which is Department of Homeland Security. And all of the planes took off and did not turn around. And because of the Supreme Court's shenanigans, again on the shadow docket, that case kind of imploded because the Supreme Court said, well, this is not how you have to challenge it, whatever. But it did serve as an object lesson for other judges, because they knew that lawyers were going to come before them and tell lies. In fact, I've observed that Drew Ensign, this lawyer, he could only come in any case a couple of times, because once he's told a lie to a federal judge, he never shows back up again.
Oh, good. That's just his job. Cool.
They send a different lawyer because he's burnt. And so, I guess it's nice he gets to, show up a couple of times in the Abrego Garcia case, a couple of times in this Alien Enemies Act detainee case. And then he's burnt, so he doesn't appear in court anymore. He'll appear on the papers, but he'll never show his face in court again because he's told a lie to a federal judge. He told a lie about Abrego Garcia. He told a lie to Judge James Boasberg about these planes. He said, I don't know if any planes are going to take off. And so that brings us to I think it's the, Labor Day weekend, the last weekend in
Mm-hmm.
August. And the government is trying to spirit away these unaccompanied Guatemalan children. They are children. And it's important to know that there are laws that protect unaccompanied minor immigrants because they're not like the same as everyone else. They can't be released. We can't do remain in Mexico. We can't do all of these because they're children. And so
Right.
under something called the Trafficking Victim Protection Reauthorization Act, they have to be transferred from the custody of the Department of Homeland Security to Health and Human Services, which is a humanitarian agency not responsible for deportation. And it's a sub-agency called the Office of Refugee Resettlement. These children are in the custody of HHS in ORR, Office of Refugee Resettlement, in foster care or in shelters. They are, they're in humanitarian placements. And what happened on Labor Day weekend was that at 10:45 p.m. on the Saturday night of Labor Day weekend, the Office of Refugee Resettlement told these foster care placements they had 2 hours to get about 90 Venezuelan children out of their beds, pack up all of their belongings and a week's worth of medication and 2 nut-free lunches, they specified, because you don't want to give a kid too much peanut butter when you're deporting them.
Yeah,
right? Snatch these kids out of their beds and put them on planes. And there was this emergency petition by lawyers for these kids who realized that the children were being snatched up at the federal courthouse in D.C. And so you had a very similar case, right? Because the government had tried to spirit away the Venezuelan men in March. And then in August, they tried to spirit away these Guatemalan children. But this time the court was ready in a way that it wasn't, right? Because we've seen all of these shenanigans from the Trump administration over the past months. And so Judge Sparkle Suknanen picked up the phone at 2:00 in the morning and issued a restraining order then and there. And she scheduled a hearing for 3 p.m. the following day, which is the Sunday of Labor Day weekend. And then the plaintiff said they are putting these children on planes right now. And she moved the hearing up. The reason that she moved so quickly to protect these children is because she knew that if she didn't, the government would fly them out. And then by the time that she appeared in court at 3 p.m., they would say, too bad, so sad. Kids are gone. And which is what they did in the JGG case back in March. And then at this hearing at 12:30, our favorite lawyer from the Justice Department, Drew Ensign, showed up and she said, "Are there planes about to take off?" And he said again, "I do not know." And she said, "I will wait until you find out, and they better not take off. I am issuing a restraining order." Because, again, we're in this place where nobody believes the government. And in fact, the government told abject lies in this hearing. They said these Venezuelan children aren't being deported. They're being reunited with their parents who asked. This was a program the Guatemalan government came to us and said, these parents desperately want their children back. Which is a lie. It was just a lie. And Judge Suknanen was like, I have a dozen affidavits from children here who say their parents didn't know they were coming back. Their parents are dead. Their parents abused them. This is an absolute lie that you're telling me. Go and make sure these planes don't take off. And you know what? Those kids were on the planes, and one of them had already taxied off the runway, and that plane came back because courts know that if they don't sit on the Trump administration and make it follow the law, the government will just violate the law and say, the issue's moot. There's nothing for you guys to adjudicate anymore. And so you've seen the judiciary react both to this chaos coming from the Supreme Court and to the chaos coming from the administration, which will just lie. It was like an absolute lie for Drew Ensign to say these children were, the parents asked us to send these children home. Absolute lie.
I mean, he was also the same guy that said, we don't have control over the planes that are over the Gulf of Mexico. And then, I think
they're out of U.S. waters. That's not consonant with any law. If, the government has ordered us to bring back people from Saudi Arabia who are in our custody and control, that was a total lie, what he said.
I mean, the next thing I was going to ask is, how much pressure can these courts take before bolts start flying off and pieces of sheet metal start coming off of our Looney Tune machine that is the American judiciary here? Because in the end, there is a Supreme Court at the top of this, and things have to get kicked up. And the Supreme Court can also just reach in and pull any case out it wants.
And it has done that.
Right. And so what happens next? How much fight can the lower courts actually put up, and for how long? Because I think that, yes, like you said, the Supreme Court is burning some of its good faith here, a lot of it. The Trump administration is burning a lot of that good faith, including with Drew Eisen. And how much of this, is a war of attrition between those two things, for how long the lower courts can last and how much good faith and goodwill the administration and the Supreme Court have.
Yeah. So I think that that's a version of a question that I get a lot as somebody who writes and podcasts and does videos about the law. And the question is, what good is the law when the Supreme Court is broken? What good are these lower court orders when the Supreme Court will just make up law? And I get that question a lot. And the answer is, look, actually, this case with the Guatemalan children is a perfect example of what happened. This lower court made that stop. Those children are still here, and there's similar litigation pending with respect to Honduran children and other nationalities.
Mhm.
And so if the question is, what is the purpose of this with the lower courts? The lower courts can throw enough sand in the gears that the Trump administration has to do something, has to change its behavior, at least in the short term. It can't go and violate the law and then have to explain itself later. So I think that that's one of the things which does, which the lower courts are doing. Are things falling apart? Are things breaking? Absolutely, they 100% are. But you have seen the lower courts, right? Judge Suknanen made sure that those Guatemalan children did not get deported. And so I think that there are things that are happening. The lower courts have indeed forced the government to disperse money, right? There was in the Harvard University case where the Trump administration tried all of these things to put pressure on Harvard to, do whatever, to stop being so woke. Right. The judge, there was a long, drawn out hearing process. It was over months. For, the first they tried to confiscate grant money and put the screws to Harvard and say, let us change all of your academic freedom, to really do all of these things to impinge on your academic freedom. And the lower court, the trial court has in fact made the Trump administration give money back and did not. One of the things that the Trump administration tried to do to put the screws to Harvard was exclude it from all foreign visas, which would mean that a third of its student body couldn't return. Well, the trial court said, don't do that. And it didn't happen. So yes, we are in a crisis situation. I would never say that we are not. But the lower courts are making a lot of difference in so many valences. We will not be able to hang on thanks only to the lower courts, but they are doing yeoman's work, and it is valuable work, and it is making a lot of difference.
Is there a point in which the Supreme Court also is going to slow down on some of these shadow docket cases because they think that they have to keep their powder dry for something more important the Trump administration is going to bring their way? Because it does feel like that they've done a lot of the work for the Trump administration here.
Right. Well, so look, we're going to be off the shadow docket soon. So let's talk about tariffs, right? Because that's another power which Trump has stolen from Congress. And he just went ahead and did it. And that in the normal order that worked its way through. He said he wanted it to go to the Court of Federal Claims. He did not want U.S. district courts to adjudicate this because the U.S. district courts are going to issue more sweeping relief. Fine. It went to the Court of Federal Claims and it went to the Court of International Trade, and the Court of International Trade said, no, you do not have emergency tariff power. Get out. And then they stayed that order, and it went to the Federal Circuit, which is the appeals court, which hears those rulings. And the Federal Circuit held hearings, had briefings, issued a ruling that said, no, you don't get, that's not a thing. You can't just steal Congress's tariff power by shouting emergency. And so then it was appealed to the Supreme Court. And in the regular order, the Supreme Court would not stay a lower court's ruling. But this time, the Trump administration said, we need you to stay the lower court's order cutting us off from, doing all of these crazy tariffs on like the herd of McDonald Islands or, wherever, Sri Lanka. Well, actually, Sri Lanka is one of our larger trading partners. But, we have substantial trade with Sri Lanka. But, the Vanuatu and all of these crazy places where Trump was like, we're slapping a 50% tariff on Vanuatu. Like, that'll teach them. But so Trump made this emergency appeal to the Supreme Court and said, I would like to brief this in 9 weeks. That is a crazy amount of time. And the Supreme Court was like, yes, sir, you got it first week of November. That's not regular order. But these cases are coming to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court giving Trump this crazy expedited briefing schedule and saying we will hear this case more or less immediately, 9 weeks or something, is giving him what he wants. But it is going to mean that the issue will be decided. So all of these cases are going to come to the Supreme Court in regular order, right? All of the impoundment cases. And, basically once the first or second impoundment case comes up, we're going to know whether Trump is going to be able to steal Congress's power or not steal Congress's power. We're going to see all of the cases are going to come to the Supreme Court this time, and the Supreme Court will have to decide. And once it issues actual precedent, and as opposed to just the big X, on the shadow docket, then we'll be living in that world. It will be a world of probably terrible laws, but it will be a world where there are rules. The Supreme Court will have remade all of those rules.
Sure.
But the rules will exist, and they won't be just like the goat entrails of, Neil Gorsuch's mind.
Right. Given, I think, and also when we see those rulings this time around, I think a lot of those are going to be built on the stuff that we saw over the summer on the shadow docket, especially when it comes to the cases like we were just talking about, the tariff cases, the immigration cases that'll be up, specifically the birthright citizenship case, and the which is the Louisiana case, right?
Well, there's a bunch of birthright citizenship cases because the Supreme Court, one of the ways which it tried to make it easier for the Trump administration to break the law was it said, nationwide injunctions. It discovered that nationwide injunctions were illegal. The Fifth Circuit and all of these crazy courts in Texas issued nationwide injunction after nationwide injunction during the Biden administration to block the Biden administration from doing something. But as soon as Trump became president, the Supreme Court discovered that actually nationwide injunctions had always been unlegal. We have always been at war with East Asia, and we have always been at war with nationwide injunctions, which we don't have them now. So what has happened is that it's forced litigants to go into all these different courts. And so there isn't a birthright decision. I mean, there were like 4 before. There are going to be so many birthright decisions because the Supreme Court has forced there to be this multiplicity of cases, right? With the Alien Enemies Act detainees, they said you can't file for a nationwide injunction. You have to get a habeas corpus, maybe habeas corpus class petition in the places where these detainees are, which meant that there were 10 cases filed in 10 separate districts. So there's going to be one case. It's going to be all of these cases coming, and it makes it more complicated, right? Because they have different fact patterns, and it makes more work for a wildly overworked federal judiciary. And the Supreme Court's going to have a lot more work, but luckily they don't care. They just do a Sharpie X.
Right. They don't care. They're just going to spit out the thing. I think the case I was thinking of was actually the redistricting case out of Louisiana. But the thing that I was going to say is that a lot of this stuff that we'll see this fall in this term is going to get built on the stuff that is off the shadow docket. And at some point, post a Trump presidency, because that will happen, post the Roberts Court in its current makeup, because that will happen.
Yeah.
Are all of these laws that are going to be made here just going to be built on pillars of salt and sand? And that's the next court's problem? What happens next?
I mean, it's very interesting to kind of speculate what comes next, right? It depends what comes next politically. I think if we could right our ship democratically, there will have to be a program of undoing what the Roberts Court has done here. And I don't think any of us wants to live in this world of wildly enhanced executive power to the point where we have almost a king who can steal power from the other branches of government, right? I mean, obviously the checks and balances don't work. I think what's going to happen is we're going to have a repeal of all of these emergency powers so that we can't have another demagogue come in. But of course, that's projecting so many steps into the future. We don't know what comes after Trump. Obviously, Trump doesn't look all that healthy. I mean, I think we will find out either, in 3.5 years or whatever, what comes after Trump. Or possibly sooner. But what we'll have to find out how we as a democracy stand up, right? If we can right our ship, we will have to treat all of these Roberts Court's decision with a big asterisk, or, mark them to be overturned, because we can't live like this with the erosion of all of these freedoms. But, it's very hard to put that stuff back in the box, right? Once you've done that. I mean, we talked about the hiring and firing cases, right? The Supreme Court let the Trump administration fire certain agency heads, and that kind of got rid of stability across in administrations, got rid of expertise, and that was the world Biden lived in. He got rid of the Trump appointees. It makes our government more partisan, less stable, less built on people who can do the right thing, not the politically expedient thing. We've seen that with the attacks on the Federal Reserve.
Right. I think it's interesting to think about the Roberts Court years as sort of the steroid years of the MLB.
Exactly.
It's going to have this little asterisk next to all these names because of how this law was made. I think the last thing I want to ask you about is also something that I asked Andrew about the last time he was on the show here. Is one of the safety valves to this thing, keeping with our mechanical metaphor here, is it that the legal profession polices itself, the American Bar Association, state bar associations? At some point, lawyers for the Department of Justice have been going in, filing bad faith briefs, lying to judges. At some point, does the legal profession police itself against these attorneys? We've seen it happen. We saw it happen in the 2020 cases.
Yeah, so that's interesting, because the legal profession really didn't police itself in any kind of effective way. Like, lawyers like Rudy Giuliani and John Eastman did wind up not able to practice law. Jeff Clark is still fighting his disbarment. He was the, he was the guy who tried to, inside the Justice Department, gin up these fake investigations, or send letters to the state legislators that claimed that there was fraud, and so that they should steal Biden's electoral votes. He also got disbarred. But I don't think that the legal profession has stood up. But I do think it is starting to stand up. And I would agree with you. I think lawyers like Drew Ensign, who have told absolute lies to the court, and made misrepresentations of fact and law, and put their names on things, I do think that they should face professional sanction. I think that the legal profession has to stand up significantly, and do what needs to be done. There are certainly bars in places where a lot of these lawyers work, in places like DC and New York, that are very clearly, and California, but it does take a very long time. Like, there was action this week toward disbarring, John Eastman, but he's still a member, theoretically. I mean, he's suspended, but he's not permanently kicked out.
Right. I think that's Sidney Powell, too. I think she's not kicked out, but I think she's suspended.
No, go back. You don't want to say that, because Texas refused to discipline Sidney Powell at all. If you want, I can tell you that. Yeah, no, Texas refused to discipline Sidney Powell.
Oh, I just didn't see that. That's fine. I can keep that. I'm going to keep that in. That's fine. No, that's okay. Yeah, but Sidney Powell does come to mind in that thing.
Right, but that's a sign that the Texas bar refused to discipline a lawyer who behaved badly, and in fact got sanctioned, right? That they said, nah, that's fine, right? That Rudy Giuliani and John Eastman got dinged, and Jeff Clark, because they were members of bars in blue states, where the bar was going to try and take a stand against what they saw was an absolute abuse of the profession and the process. But in Texas, that's not going to happen. I mean, look, Texas can't even restrain Ken Paxton. And in fact, there was a bar complaint against Ken Paxton, and Ken Paxton, who's the Attorney General of Texas, famously corrupt, turned around and investigated the state bar. So I don't know. Don't look to us, man. I don't think we're going to be able to do this. But the judges are doing a good job.
The judges are it. The judges will save us? ?
I mean, I think that they will certainly, try and hold it back as far as they can. Sisyphean and effort.
Yeah. Liz, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it, as always.
Thank you. All right. Take care.
I want to thank Liz again for coming on the show, and as always, being the legal voice that we turn to here at Make It Make Sense. You can follow her at Law and Chaos Podcast and Substack and see her on Legal Eagle on YouTube. Whenever she pops up there, it is always a watch and a listen for me. But that is it for today's episode. Please rate and review the show, whatever podcast app you listen to it on. Like, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, and leave a comment below if you're a watcher on YouTube. Sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack. It is just $5 a month to get access to all sorts of great bonus content, including a new interview with me that'll be up next Monday with Mike Nellis, friend of the show. I'll be on his show on Monday, and then you'll be able to see it on my Substack after that. And as always, share the show on social media. It's Mims Newspod. That's MIMS Newspod, all one word on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on Twitter and Bluesky, and at Grant Herms TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you next week.